Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to start another interview question series, which is scenario based software testing interview questions and answers. And in this series, I'm going to cover most of the scenario based software testing, manual testing, interview questions and answers. And I'll be explaining all of these questions and answers with examples, with real life experiences and my experiences that I have gone through in last 19 to 20 years in the IT industry. So it will be very hands-on, practical based. Even if there is something which is a theoretical answer, I'll be explaining it based on my experience, and that will be helpful for anyone who is a fresher, experienced candidate to basically go ahead and answer the questions effectively and also learn along with this whole process how you are going to say, for example, there are many scenario based questions, how you are going to test a particular functionality. So I'll be explaining those step by step with real examples. This is part one of this particular series, and there will be many parts coming in this particular series. So each part will have 4 to 5 questions, and each question will be really relevant and helpful for you, not only from interview perspective, but from a massive learning and understanding perspective, which will help you to test the application when you get into the job as well. Now, before we get started, right, the first thing I would like to request is if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go ahead, subscribe, share this content with your colleagues, with your friends. And in this particular series, I would yes, because based on this survey, based on your like, I understand that yes, you need this sort of content, and I'll be producing more parts to this particular whole series, right? So whatever part I have already planned, along with that, I'll plan more and more question and answer in this particular scenario based software testing interview question and answer series. So give a thumbs up, comment yes if you want more and more parts to this particular series. Now how will be the pattern, or how will be the format? So each part of this particular series will have 4 to 5 questions, and I'll be explaining these questions in a very practical and scenario based approach based on my personal experience from past 19 to 20 years into software testing, and then how you are going to approach testing, right? So it will be very hands-on and practical answer and scenario based answer that you can basically go ahead and use in your interview question, and also apply this learning into your actual project. So let's get started and see what we are going to cover in this part one. So in this part one, I'm going to cover 4 important questions. Let's see what the questions are. So the first question is, how will you test customer registration web page, customer registration web portal, or any, registration web portal, right? So any web page, web portal that somebody is asking the answer, you can correlate and answer in a similar way that I'm going to explain here. The second question is, how will you approach testing for any requirement or user story? Okay, so it doesn't matter whether it's a requirement or user story, the approach that you are going to apply is consistent and same. So you can also explain step-by-step process that I'm going to give here. The third question I'm going to answer is, how will you overcome the challenge of not having documentation for testing? Very important question, scenario based. And then why is regression testing in Agile development challenging, and how will you handle it? Okay, so these are the 4 questions that I'm going to cover in the scenario based software testing interview question and answer part 1. Now let's go ahead and understand each one by one. So the first question, how will you test customer registration web page or web portal? Okay, now before jumping to the answer, first thing is important that you always go ahead and clarify. If you're not sure what exactly the requirement is, how you are going to test it, right? So first thing, when you are going to test, when somebody asks you how you are going to test this, you have to first understand, you have to cross question and question the interviewer what sort of requirement are available, right? Or what exactly the person wants to test in something. You don't assume stuff, right? So first thing, always clarify the requirement from the interviewer and then start answering. Why this is important? Because when the customer says, when the interviewer is asking customer registration web page, okay, if you just assume that customer registration web page will have first name, last name, and only 2-3 fields, maybe the interviewer wants more field to be there, right? So as the person who is answering this, what interviewer wants to understand is whether you will clarify the requirements or not. And then you will start approach testing, right? Then you will approach testing, because unless until you understand what exactly you are going to test, how you are going to test, right? So this is the first thing that interviewer wants to understand, whether you are going to inquire about the details or not, right? For example, what things you need to ask on any web page, whether they ask login functionality or registration page functionality, you need to ask some set of questions, right? Now, first thing you will ask is about the UI, the user interface, right? Graphical user interface, because it's a web page, web portal. So how many fields are there? Is there first name? Is there middle name? Is there last name? Okay. Is there date of birth? What all information is being captured on that particular web page? Okay. That is the question that you have to ask. All right. Then which API is being used? Is there any API that is being used? Is it a SOAP or REST to communicate, to send this particular form information to the server? Is there any database? Which database is being used? Which business rules are applied? Are there any business rules as well? Say, for example, this information is submitted from the form. Then based on the date of birth, is there any backend business rule that will run? And then the information will be stored accordingly in the database. Okay. So these are some of the questions. Now, asking this question, before asking, you need to understand the overall service-oriented architecture, right? So basically, if we put, in a very simple term, so let me open the whiteboard here, okay, and I'll explain, okay. So now, say for example, if I am interviewing and you are asking me the question, okay. So I have asked you to test a web portal, okay. So this is graphical user interface. Now you need to ask how many fields are there. So as an interviewer, I'll say, okay, there is a first name field. All right. So first name field, there is a last name field. Okay. And then there is a date of birth field and then address. Okay. So now you know that on the graphical user interface, there are 4 fields that you have to test, right? Then you have to ask, how will this data, whatever is being filled, get tested basically, right? So how will this data get transferred over the network, over the internet, right? So which web service is being used? So SOAP or REST or anything, right? Could be anything. Then how will this information that you are sending from the form will store, right? Which database is there? Okay. Where this information will get stored, what will be the tables, etc. So as soon as you will start answering or basically asking these questions themselves answer or provide the answer to the interviewer, that you actually know the overall how the applications are built, right? So this is basically, like you know that this is a client graphical user interface. Then you have, if there is a business rule, the business rule. So for example, if date of birth is, if a person entered a date of birth and based on date of birth, the age calculation happens, and based on age calculation, the information gets stored into the database. Okay. So if the person is minor, less than 18 years, based on the date of birth that is being entered, they are stored as a minor, right? Or minor flag is checked in the database table, right? So this is one of the business rules that you have to check, right? You have to ask, is there any business rule? So they'll understand that the business rule as well, right? So based on the input that is being provided from the user interface, the input can be manipulated, and business rules in the software are the rules, or basically it's just a piece of code that will see what information is being provided. And if date of birth, based on date of birth, the age is less than 18, then this particular record needs to be saved like this flag needs to be checked, right? So these are some of the common questions that you need to basically ask, right? So when we say, service oriented architecture, right, or client server, right? So these, when you segregate the graphical user interface, when you say SOAP or REST, for different, operations, you have different APIs available. When you have business rules, when you ask question about, which database, then what all need to be tested, right? So now okay, in the graphical user interface, I'll test the validations of the first name, last name, if there is any validation there, that special characters shouldn't be allowed. Only characters should be allowed, right? Only numbers should be allowed if allowed. In date of birth, no junk characters are allowed. This is UI validation that you will test. In address, only valid address is allowed. So if any of these rules are applied or validations are used on the UI, then you will start answering that I'll test these on the UI, these things on the UI. Okay. Then if UI is not available, say for example, upfront UI is not available. Okay. Then I'll go ahead and straight away get the web service that is available. Okay. For this address registration, then in that SOAP or REST service, I'll provide these values and then hit that through Postman or SOAP UI or any API testing tool and ensure that that business rule, if business rule is applicable, that gets triggered and the data is stored successfully in the appropriate tables in the database, right? So now you have explained everything end to end in a very crisp form. If you get a whiteboard, use it. Okay. Ask the interviewer, can I use the whiteboard? And once you go through this process, I'm pretty sure if you explain this way, the database, the business rule, the API, the UI, the validations that you are going to test, that is not going to stop you from being selected into that particular organization. Okay. So try to answer using a graphical. If you are getting a whiteboard, use it. Okay. So this is basically how you are going to answer this question, how you are going to test customer registration web page, right? Not only I'll test the validation on the UI, I'll test, this validation, that validation. No, software application is just not the UI, right? It's a lot more than that. There are APIs involved. There is a business rule involved. There is databases. There could be events, notifications, n number of things. You can expand this answer as much as you want, but this answer from a fresher to 5 to 10 years experience, whatever I have told, is good enough to prove that you actually understand how softwares are built and applications are built. Then you can go ahead and elaborate more options around events and messages and queues if you want to do that, right? But I don't think that will be required. Okay. So this is the first question. Now moving on to the second question of part 1. How will you approach testing any user story in Agile project? Okay. So whether it's user story or any requirement, it doesn't matter what sort of requirement it is or user story. Okay. So usually when we say requirement in Agile project, it's user story. Okay. Now when we say how will you approach testing any user story? So the first and foremost thing is understanding that user story. How will you understand? You will read the information that is mentioned there. You will read the acceptance criteria that is mentioned in the user story. Okay. When we say acceptance criteria, it is the criteria from the end user's perspective that the customer wants this to be fulfilled as part of this particular functionality. Okay. That's the acceptance criteria. So it's kind of a, complete requirement. So understanding that, if you are not able to understand, going to the business analyst, understanding details from them. If you still have doubts, asking questions so that every detail of the user story is clear to you. Every detail of the requirement is clear to you as the tester. Okay. So that's the first sort of important thing. The second thing is define high level scenarios, what you are going to test. Now, based on that user story, you have to define, based on the acceptance criteria, what all test scenarios you are going to cover. Okay. What can you test in that particular user story? What an end user or how end user is going to interact as part of that user story. So for example, the user story is to build the same example, registration functionality. So as part of that registration functionality, what all is in scope? Okay. So for example, for this particular sprint, only UI is in scope. Okay. So registration functionality, UI build is in scope. So in the UI build, the acceptance criteria is it should have first name, last name, date of birth, and address field. And first name should have this validation, right? Only alphabets are allowed there. Last name, only alphabet should be accepted, right? So based on that, you will say, I'll write high level one-liners, what I'm going to test for each of these fields, right? So that's defining those high level scenarios. Then elaborating those into steps, which is test cases. Okay. Then I'll go ahead and elaborate those into test cases to make sure that I understand how I am going to test, right? So for first name, last name field, what all steps I'm going to follow to test, right? So that's elaborating those scenarios into the test cases and ensuring that it's there into the test management tool. Now in Agile, many people think that there is, no documentation. That's not true. Do the documentation, whatever is required. In case your project requires detailed documented test cases, you have to have those. Okay. In case that is not required and you are just fine with, one-liners or just very minimal 2-3 liners, that's okay as well. It depends on what sort of complexity, regulatory requirement project you are working in, right? If you are in bank, you will definitely have, detailed test cases that need to be written because of the regulatory requirement. In telecom, regulatory requirement. In hospitals, regulatory requirement, right? So there are certain industries wherein it doesn't matter you are following Agile, you will have to document the scenarios and test cases in very well formatted manner because of the requirement. Then in some other projects which don't have that much regulatory requirement, you might come up with the less documentation, right? So these are 3 key points that you can basically mention how you are going to approach testing for any requirement or user story in Agile project, right? Understanding, that is important. If you're not able to understand, collaborate with the team, understand the details, then define high level scenarios and then elaborate those into the steps how you are going to test. Okay. Now moving on to the third question of part 1. How will you overcome the challenge of having limited or inaccurate documentation for testing, right? Very common interview question. Now, if you have limited documentation, inaccurate documentation, and you are part of that particular project, how will you approach testing, right? Now, this happens many times, and with most of you, this will happen if you are in a particular organization wherein documentation hasn't been done very well. Okay, now no software will be built without requirement, right? It's not a case. Maybe the documentation will be less or things are not documented at all. Okay, the developers got some random documentation and then based on that they build something and customer has accepted it, but the overall requirement document format, the detailed level of acceptance criteria that should have been there is not there. If that's the case, then how you are going to handle this sort of testing for inaccurate or limited documentation? First point, try to find any related document that is available. So how you will answer? I'll try to find any related document that is available in that particular project. It's not the case that you go into the project and there is absolutely no document at all, unless and until there was a server and server has absolutely gone, crashed and couldn't be recovered. Okay, if that's the case, that's a separate story. Now, if that is the case, say for example, no documentation at all, and your application is running on the cloud, still you can go ahead and still you can go ahead and test it, future releases, and build the documentation. How? Go ahead and talk to the project members, to the subject matter experts, to anyone who has built that application, okay, who understands that application. So if you are able to find any related document, well and good. If not, talk to the project members, subject matter experts, okay, SMEs, and anyone who was the part of that particular project. Okay. If you are not able to find anyone who was the part of the project, then I will go ahead and talk to subject matter experts. Get the information from them. I will not only get the information, but I'll also regularly document that particular information in a proper document. Okay, whether it's Confluence, Word document or whatever. I'll document high level functionalities based on the conversation and understanding that I'll have from the SMEs and the existing team members who had worked on that particular project. After documentation, you will get a high level understanding of the requirement, right? So even while talking, you will see what all key functionalities are there in that particular application. Then you will document it. Based on the document, you will understand the flow, the business flow, what functionalities, high level functionalities are available in that particular application. Then I as a tester will go ahead and apply exploratory testing technique to explore more about the application, and as in along I do the exploratory testing, I'll then go ahead and document scenarios and test cases. Accordingly, I'll document other issues that are basically found, right? So this is how I'm going to approach testing for any application or software that has limited or inaccurate documentation for testing. This is how you are going to answer this particular question. Okay, now let's move on to the last question of this part 1. So the last question is, why regression testing in Agile development challenging and how will you handle it? Okay, now why is regression testing in Agile challenging? Okay, Agile development approach is iterative. Okay, so every say for example, you are following Scrum is 2 to 4 weeks development cycle, mostly 2 weeks. Okay, it's kind of 90% plus organization you will find that they are following 2 to 3 weeks development cycle. And in 2 to 3 weeks, development team, they build new features. Okay, so new features are added and defect fixes are done every sprint. Because of this new feature addition, every next sprint, you will have a new set of features or new code being added to the existing code, right? So say for example, sprint 1, developers build 5 user stories. So they'll write code for 5 user stories. Then in next sprint 2, they have picked 4 user stories. So they'll build code on top of whatever existing code was there in sprint 1, right? So there is a new addition of code. Now, when do we need regression testing? Any defect fixes or addition or any changes to the code. Now in agile development, there is an addition to the code or changes to the code every sprint. Okay, every next sprint there is a build or the development that happens on the previous build. So changes are happening continuously on the existing code. Maybe not every piece of code that has been written previously, but some or most part of the code that is being built previously is then again changed into the new sprint or built upon the previous code. Okay, not change, but in the next sprint build upon the previous build or previous code that was done in previous. Because of that, there is a need for regression testing. Why? Because regression testing, when it is done, any defect fixes or any code changes to ensure that the new code that has been added or changed does not impact the existing functionality, right? So that is why regression testing in Agile is really challenging. Okay, so this is the first part of the question that you are going to answer. Why it is challenging? Then how will I handle it? Okay, I'll follow a risk-based approach. Okay, risk-based testing approach to handle this. So in Agile, usually risk-based testing approach is helpful if you're not automating. Okay, if you're not automating your regression test suite every sprint, which becomes really tedious unless you have ample resources and support from the leadership. So when you are doing testing, say for example, sprint 1. Meanwhile, when you are done testing, you have to ensure that you also automate any regression test cases during that sprint itself. So you will need support. You will need people to quickly convert those test cases, regression test cases from sprint 1 into automated scripts so that they can be used in next sprint to execute automatically, right? So if that's not the case, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and follow the risk-based testing approach. In next sprint, I'll ask my developers and team members what all key features you are updating or building upon this particular sprint that I can go ahead and execute regression test for, right? So in sprint 1 itself, I'll go ahead and for each of the key functionalities, I'll start preparing the regression test suite. So I'll add some test cases into regression test suite. And then in next sprint, I'll execute those. So if I'll follow risk-based testing approach in next sprint, I'll say only this functionality has been updated as part of sprint 2. So I'll only execute 3 test cases instead of 30 test cases that I have identified as my regression test. So following that, if you don't have the automated regression test. So risk-based testing approach will help you. Best part or best thing to do in agile development to handle regression testing is to automate. So try to automate regression test suite, and that will be the best approach to basically handle regression testing in the agile development, right? Now let me quickly go to the whiteboard, okay? And I'll also draw this and explain this. Okay, so when we say agile, right, so we have sprints. Okay, so for example 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, so just consider this as a timeline. Okay, 2 to 4 weeks. Now in this 2 to 4 weeks, developers will pick certain user stories. So they'll say, for example, 1, 2, or they picked 5 user stories, and testers will start testing or test these 5 user stories when they build. Now tester will then identify what all regression test cases are there out of these. Okay, so they'll prepare a regression test suite from this sprint. Okay, then in sprint 2, okay, so sprint 2 started. Okay, and in sprint 2 there will be more user stories that will be built, right? So this is the timeline. So there will be more user stories that will be built. So this regression suite that has been prepared from first sprint either needs to be executed fully, because there are, as part of the new sprint, right? So sprint 2, so this is sprint 1, sprint 2, you are building, your development team is building on top of whatever code has been written here. Okay, so there are changes in the code, so ideally you should be executing this whole regression test cases again in sprint 2. Then in sprint 3, okay, because it's incremental and iterative development, until and unless all the functionalities that are required by the application are being built, you will follow these 2 to 4 week sprints. Okay, so every sprint will be building on top of what? On top of the previous code that was there. Okay, and every sprint there will be new additions to the regression suite. New test cases will be added from each of the sprint, right? So your regression test suite initially in sprint 1 was 10 test cases, sprint 2 was 15, sprint 3 was 25, sprint 4 it will become 35, sprint 5 it will become 50, right? So every sprint your regression test suite will increase. So you can imagine, can you accommodate these 50 test cases that you have accumulated as part of the previous 4 sprints to execute in sprint 5 along with the new features that you are testing? That is a lot of overhead. So what will you do? Will you keep adding more team members to execute this regression test suite if you are doing it manually? No, right? That's not a feasible approach. So what you will follow? You will follow risk-based testing, right? So RBT, if you are doing it manually. So you will have a team meeting, what all key features you are changing on top of what you have built previously. Then out of that, you will say, okay, out of these 50, I'll execute, 5 or 10 test cases. All right. Then you will be able to manage that regression problem into your agile development. Best option is to automate all of these in every sprint. So for example, in first sprint there were 10 test cases. You have the support from the team. There are automation SDETs that will basically go ahead and automate these. Then in next sprint there are 5 more test cases. They are also automated. So by sprint 4 you have 50 test cases. They are all automated. So in sprint 5 you have automated test suite that can be easily run while you are focusing on the progression testing, right? So this is how you can basically draw and explain why it becomes challenging, why regression testing becomes challenging, and how to overcome it. If you are not doing automation, follow risk-based testing approach. If you are doing automation, well and good, right? So this is how I'll be going ahead and approaching regression testing and its challenges into the agile software development. Okay, so this was the 4th question. All right, and the last question of the scenario-based software testing interview question and answer part 1. Okay, so that's all for this particular video. Please go ahead, give a thumbs up, comment yes if you want more scenario-based software testing interview question and answers like this. And I'll be publishing continuously the series on scenario-based manual testing interview question. So that's all for this video. I hope it was helpful. Thank you very much for watching.